There's a window your brain uses every single day to repair itself, and it doesn't happen in a clinic, it doesn't come from a prescription, and it doesn't cost you anything extra. It happens at night while you're asleep. And what you do in the last 1 to 2 hours before you close your eyes can push that process in two completely different directions. It can speed up how your brain ages, or it can support how it repairs. Most people over 60 have been told a very simple story that memory slips, mental fog, and slower thinking are just part of getting older, something to expect, something to manage. But that's not what the newer research is pointing to. What's actually showing up is something different. The aging brain isn't broken, it isn't shutting down on its own, it's operating without the inputs it needs. The signals are off, the nutrients are off, the environment isn't lined up for repair, and the period right before sleep, when the brain is getting ready to do its most important overnight work, is one of the most underused opportunities there is. Tonight, we're going to focus on three fruits. Nothing rare, nothing expensive, nothing complicated. Just three widely available foods that have been studied and shown to interact with the brain in very specific ways. When they're used at the right time, they line up with what your brain is already trying to do. They help clear out waste, support the rebuilding of neural connections, influence the chemistry tied to memory, and help preserve the structure that keeps thinking sharp over time. This isn't a general wellness conversation. We're going into the actual physiology, mitochondria, neurotrophic factors, melatonin pathways, neuroinflammation, the kind of mechanisms that show up in journals like Alzheimer's and Dementia, Frontiers in Aging, Neuroscience, and Neurology, because if your brain is doing this work every night, the least you can do is understand what actually helps it do that work better. Once you move past 60, several systems in the brain start shifting at the same time, and they don't shift in isolation. The first one is BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. This is the molecule tied to building new neural connections and keeping existing ones alive, and it starts to drop. Not suddenly, but steadily enough that the brain loses part of its ability to renew itself. At the same time, the glymphatic system becomes less efficient. This is the system responsible for clearing waste out of the brain, and it does most of its work during deep sleep. As that efficiency declines, the cleanup slows down. Your gut microbiome also changes. The populations of bacteria that help produce key neurochemicals begin to shift, and that affects signaling between the gut and the brain. And then there are the mitochondria. Inside brain cells, they start accumulating damage faster than the brain can remove it, which changes how energy is produced and how clean that energy is. These changes don't happen one at a time, they build on top of each other. That's why the timing of what you eat before sleep starts to matter in a very specific way. The glymphatic system is most active during the early hours of deep sleep. During that period, cerebrospinal fluid moves through the spaces between brain cells, washing out metabolic waste, including amyloid plaques and tau proteins, the same compounds associated with Alzheimer's and faster cognitive decline. If you go into that window after eating something that disrupts the system, a spike in blood sugar, inflammatory inputs, alcohol, you interfere with that entire cycle. The cleanup doesn't run the same way. If you go into it having supplied the brain with the inputs that support that process, the system runs more effectively. So it isn't just about what you eat. It's about what you eat and when you eat it. And what the research consistently points to is a window of about 1 to 2 hours before sleep, where those inputs line up with the brain's repair cycle. When you slow this down, you start seeing the same few mechanisms show up again and again, and they all move in the same direction. When you track this back, it keeps coming to mitochondria because they're the ones deciding how much usable energy your brain cells actually have to work with. When that system starts slipping, everything that depends on it starts slipping with it. At the same time, there's neuroinflammation, which doesn't show up as a single event, but more like a background process that keeps building. And what's becoming clearer is that this low-grade inflammation is more closely tied to cognitive decline than aging itself. Then there's BDNF. After 60, levels drop, and with that drop comes a reduced ability to form and maintain neural connections. Certain compounds, especially anthocyanins, have been shown to influence that pathway in a measurable way. You also have the serotonin to melatonin sequence that unfolds as you move into sleep. That shift is what signals the brain to transition into deeper stages, and it sets the conditions for everything that follows overnight. Running alongside that is the gut brain axis. It's not one directional. What happens in the gut feeds into the brain, and certain polyphenols can change how gut bacteria behave, which then changes what gets produced during the night. And all of this converges in deep, slow wave sleep. That stage is where the brain does the bulk of its repair work, and without it, the rest of these processes don't operate the same way. Before we go deeper into each one, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss future breakdowns like this. And I'm curious where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments. We've got people tuning in from all over the world, across 6 continents, and it's always interesting to see how far this conversation reaches. When you look at how this plays out, it starts to come down to how specific foods interact with those same mechanisms and timing. What's happening with the first fruit starts at a level most people don't think about, and it doesn't begin in the brain, it begins in the gut. Picture your brain cells like small production sites. Inside each one, there are thousands of tiny energy units, mitochondria, and they're responsible for generating the energy your neurons rely on to signal, store information, and stay functional. As time goes on, some of those units stop working the way they should. Instead of producing clean energy, they begin to generate unstable byproducts, and those start to build up. Your brain does have a way to deal with that. There's a built-in system that identifies damaged mitochondria, breaks them down, and clears them out so they can be replaced. That process is called mitophagy. It's essentially a quality control system running in the background. When that system is working, the turnover stays clean. When it slows down, the damaged components begin to accumulate, and that buildup starts interfering with how the entire cell operates, including signaling tied to memory and cognition. This is one of the mechanisms that keeps showing up in age-related cognitive decline. And this is where pomegranate comes into the picture. What it contains aren't active compounds in the form your body uses right away. It carries polyphenols, specifically L-glutanins and ellagic acid, and once those reach the gut, certain bacteria convert them into a metabolite called urolithin A. That conversion step is what makes the difference. What makes that metabolite stand out is what it does once it's in the system. Urolithin A has been identified as a strong activator of mitophagy, and this isn't coming from theory alone, it's been tested directly. A 2024 study published in Alzheimer's and Dementia, conducted by researchers at the University of Copenhagen in collaboration with the National Institute on Aging, looked at multiple Alzheimer's mouse models and found consistent effects. In those models, researchers saw improvements in learning and memory, along with reductions in neuroinflammation and restoration of mitophagy-related processes. What stood out even more was the comparison point. The level of effect was reported to be comparable to NAD-related interventions, which are often considered among the more advanced approaches in this area. There's another layer to it as well. A separate 2024 paper in Nutrients showed that urolithin A activates SIRT1, a gene tied to cellular maintenance processes that include DNA repair, regulation of inflammation, and broader aspects of cellular longevity, including in brain tissue. The timing of all of this lines up with how your body processes the fruit. The conversion from those original polyphenols into urolithin A doesn't happen instantly. It takes several hours, and that delay is what creates the overlap with the early stages of sleep. If the fruit is eaten roughly 1 to 2 hours before bed, the production of urolithin A tends to rise during the first part of the night, which is when the glymphatic system is most active and when the brain is already engaged in deeper cleanup and repair. In terms of how this is used in practice, the amounts stay simple, roughly half to a full pomegranate worth of arils in the evening. If whole fruit isn't practical, a pure pomegranate juice without added sugar, around 4 to 6 ounces, works as an alternative. There's also a pairing element that shows up in the original protocol. A small amount of fat, something like a few walnuts or a bit of olive oil, with a light salad supports the absorption of those polyphenols. And one detail that matters, if the gut environment is off, if there's imbalance in the microbiome, that conversion step into urolithin A may not happen efficiently at first. In that case, the underlying microbiome needs time to shift before the full effect shows up. Blueberries are a little different because their compounds don't just stay in the bloodstream, they actually reach the brain. The active components are anthocyanins, mainly cyanidin and delphinidin, part of a larger group known as flavonoids. What makes these different from most dietary compounds is that they can pass through the blood brain barrier. Most substances never make it across that boundary. These do. Once inside, they begin interacting with brain tissue in ways that have been measured across multiple studies. A large-scale analysis published in 2021 Inches, Neurology followed tens of thousands of individuals over time and found a clear association. Higher intake of flavonoids, especially anthocyanins from foods like blueberries, was linked to about a 24% lower risk of cognitive decline. What also stood out was the amount. The effect was observed with intake as low as half a serving per day, which puts it well within a range people can realistically maintain. Where this becomes more specific is how those compounds affect BDNF, the factor tied to how the brain builds and maintains its connections. BDNF acts almost like a growth signal for the brain. It supports the formation of new neurons, helps stabilize existing pathways, and plays a role in protecting cells from breaking down. And the region most tied to this, the hippocampus, is also the one most closely linked to memory and most sensitive to age-related changes. What's been observed is that anthocyanins from blueberries can increase activity in that pathway. A 2023 study published in Frontiers in Psychology looked at polyphenol-rich blueberry and grape extracts in older adults with mild cognitive impairment and reported improvements in episodic memory and overall cognitive performance. The researchers connected those changes to increased BDNF signaling and activity in proteins like CREB, which are directly involved in how short-term memories are stabilized into long-term storage. There's also data from a 2022 randomized controlled trial showing that regular intake of wild blueberries improved processing speed in older adults with early cognitive decline. And the timing lines up with how these effects unfold. The increase in cerebral blood flow and signaling activity doesn't happen immediately after consumption. It builds with measurable peaks showing up roughly 2 hours later. That places it right alongside the period when the brain is actively consolidating memory during sleep. In terms of use, the amounts stay straightforward, about half a cup to a full cup in the evening. Fresh or frozen both work, and in some cases, frozen berries carry slightly higher antioxidant levels because they're preserved at peak ripeness. What tends to interfere is added sugar. Products like sweetened jams or processed blends shift the response in a different direction, so the focus stays on the berries themselves rather than anything built around them. What starts to matter here is sleep itself, because without the right kind of sleep, the rest of these processes don't run the way they're supposed to. The brain's cleanup system, the glymphatic system, is tied almost entirely to slow wave sleep. That's the stage where fluid moves through brain tissue and carries away waste that builds up during the day. When that stage is shortened or disrupted, those waste products, including amyloid and tau, begin to accumulate more quickly. That buildup doesn't happen all at once. It develops gradually and reflects how often that overnight cleaning cycle is incomplete. This becomes more noticeable as the body ages, because the signals that drive sleep start to change. Melatonin levels decline over time, and by the time someone reaches their 70s, those levels can drop to less than half of what they were decades earlier. That shift changes how easily sleep begins, how deeply it holds, and how much time is actually spent in the stages where the brain does its most important repair work. What makes kiwi different is how directly it feeds into those signals. It contains measurable amounts of melatonin, around 24 micrograms per gram, along with serotonin and amino acids like tryptophan and phenylalanine that the brain uses to build its core neurotransmitters. So instead of forcing the system, it supplies the pieces the brain is already using to shift into deeper sleep. This has been measured as well. A 2023 study in Frontiers in Nutrition looked at people consuming kiwi with their evening meal and found increases in both 5-HIAA, a serotonin metabolite, and 6-sulfathimelatonin, a marker of melatonin production. Along with that, participants showed improvements in sleep quality, morning alertness, and fewer sleep disturbances. There's also direct trial data. In one study, consuming 2 medium kiwis about an hour before bed was associated with measurable improvements in sleep duration and overall sleep efficiency. The pattern stays consistent. The compounds are absorbed, serotonin levels rise, that feeds into melatonin production, and the brain transitions more effectively into the stages where repair actually happens. In terms of how this is used, it stays simple. 2 medium green kiwis, about an hour before sleep. Some people keep the skin on since it contains additional fiber and polyphenols. Others blend it if the texture isn't ideal. Either way, the timing stays the same. What starts to come together is how these three fruits don't act in isolation. They line up with different parts of the same system. Kiwi feeds into the serotonin pathway that shifts into melatonin, and that sets the structure for deeper sleep. Blueberries are already in circulation, with anthocyanins crossing into the brain and influencing BDNF levels along with cerebral blood flow. At the same time, pomegranate is being processed in the gut, with its compounds converting into urolithin A and interacting with mitochondrial cleanup through mitophagy. Each one is working on a different part of the same overnight cycle. And the reason this alignment matters more later in life is because the margin gets smaller. BDNF levels are lower than they used to be. The lymphatic system doesn't clear as efficiently. The diversity in the microbiome has shifted. Melatonin output has dropped. None of these changes stop the process, but they reduce how much room there is for error. That's where timing and selection start to carry more weight. There's also the question people often have around blood sugar. The fruits being used here sit on the lower to moderate end of the glycemic scale. Blueberries are around 53, kiwi comes in close to 50, and pomegranate seeds are significantly lower, around 18. In the portions described, they don't tend to create the kind of spike that interferes with sleep. For those who are more sensitive to glucose, combining them with a small amount of protein or fat, something like plain Greek yogurt, a handful of walnuts, or a spoon of almond butter can help keep that response more stable through the night. There's one additional fruit that fits into this pattern as well, even though it wasn't part of the main three. Tart cherries, especially Montmorency cherries, contain both melatonin and anthocyanins. A 2025 review in Food Science and Nutrition reported improvements in sleep duration and efficiency, along with reductions in inflammatory markers like CRP and IL-6. And in preclinical work, anthocyanins from tart cherries have been shown to accumulate in brain tissue and reduce inflammation in regions tied to memory. They're not always as accessible in fresh form, but the juice version shows up as a practical option that can be used alongside or rotated with the others. What all of this points to is that the brain isn't just drifting in one direction with age. Each night, it's either moving toward repair or moving toward decline, and that direction is shaped by the conditions in place before sleep begins. There are three things that consistently show up as central to that process. The first is clearance, how effectively the lymphatic system is able to remove waste during deep sleep. The second is support for neural growth and maintenance, which is where BDNF comes in. And the third is the ability to clear out damaged components inside cells, especially through mitophagy. The three fruits, we've walked through each line up with one of those. Blueberries are tied to BDNF signaling and the processes that support memory. Pomegranate feeds into mitophagy through the production of urolithin A. And kiwi influences the sleep architecture itself, which everything else depends on. None of this requires a complicated setup. The simplest way to approach it is to pick one of them, use it about an hour before bed, and stay consistent with it for a couple of weeks. Pay attention to how sleep feels, how clear thinking feels in the morning, whether that sense of mental fog shifts at all. The pattern isn't random. It reflects how the system is responding. If this gave you a clearer picture of how your brain actually works through the night, take a moment to like the video. And if you want more of this kind of breakdown, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because when you look at it this way, your brain isn't something separate from your daily choices. It's one of the most valuable systems you have, and it responds directly to how those choices line up over time.